So welcome all. Today we're going to be talking about remote leadership, and I'm going to share a screen with you so you can see the presentation that we've planned for today. So what we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to take a little bit of a tour around the world of research into remote leadership, how remote leadership works, what kinds of people are suited to remote leadership, and also how to lead people remotely, how to ensure that you manage effectively the relationships that you have with staff when they are working remotely. So to outline the objectives in more detail, the challenges of leading remotely, in other words, what's easy about it, what's difficult about it, what makes a staff member suited to remote work, the question of how do we know whether a person will be able to work effectively remotely. We're going to be talking about a thing called engagement and remote work, because one of the things that we know is one of the biggest challenges of remote work is to maintain high levels of engagement. Engagement being a positive psychological condition that people have at work when they are productive, when they're enjoying their work, and when they're doing good quality work. So engagement is a very important thing for work. We're going to be talking about what you can do to maximize engagement in remote workers. We're going to be talking about how to ensure that the people that you are recruiting at the moment are suited to remote work. And we're also going to tell you about how to lead for it. And we're going to finish off with some specific tips and techniques for what's called in the research literature distributed leadership. Distributed leadership meaning simply leadership of people who you don't eyeball every day, leadership of people who you are dealing with digitally. Now, a couple of things about this presentation. There is a recorded version of this being recorded, and in addition to that, if you want a copy of the slides, you will be able to get a copy of the slides. So for those of you who are interested in finding out more about this topic, you will be able to get hold of the slides, which also have some research citations in them. Working from home, and this is an interesting diagram. This is a statistical analysis of what has happened in working from home in Australia from the period from January 2010 to January 2020. And in fact, I guess one of the things that we see is that this is no work from home, and this is some work from home. And if you look at this 10-year period, I guess that one of the things that we see is that the amount of work from home really grew almost not at all over the course of 10 years in Australia. Now, we all know that since around about February 2020, there's been an extremely rapid growth in levels of working from home in Australia. And we actually, the reason we don't have a percentage here is because we don't really know exactly what the numbers are in terms of working from home right now, but we do know that they're much higher than they have been previously. So in the United States of America, one of the things that we found is that over the same approximately the same 10-year period, about 16% of people work remotely at least some of the time. So you see that that's actually less than in Australia. So they're starting from a low base, but they've also had extremely rapid growth. So between 2005 and 2015, that's grown rapidly. And I think one of the reasons for that, two reasons. One is that the technology enabling people to work remotely has improved enormously over that 10-year period. But I think also the United States is a very mobile workforce. It's quite common for people historically to move from city to city to take up a job. And of course, if you can work remotely, you don't have that same concern. You don't have the same need to relocate. There's a needs factor there. So there's a little bit about the history in recent times. So it raises the question of what will the new normal be? Now, I think that one of the things that you can understand in my job, I'm an organizational psychology type, and I speak to a range of different organizations every day. And one of the pieces of feedback we've had from many people is that they've found that remote work has worked extremely well for them. And so concerns about it have evaporated. People perhaps historically took the view, well, this is a job that could not be done remotely, but now they take the view, well, actually, this is working pretty well. And so I'm going to persist with it, or we're going to persist for it. Now, there's no doubt about it that across the world, there is a widespread and global recession, which means that most organizations are under some form of financial pressure. And so I know a couple of people in commercial real estate, and they're saying that people all over the market are simply refusing to secure leases, and that they're actually intending to have a much smaller real estate footprint than they historically had. Now, if that's the case, then you do have a new normal. So mass commuting is a bad thing from an environmental, public health and lifestyle point of view. And so people are seeking to get away from that. And a rush of new technologies such as cloud-based applications have meant that we're more technically ready to undertake this. And there are multiple tales of companies shrinking their offices or abandoning their offices entirely. And so I'm going to launch a poll now, because the people who are here in this webinar, I'm going to give you the opportunity to complete a poll. And we're going to ask you, after the COVID-19 crisis resolves, what do you think your organisation will do? Will it have more remote work than before, the same as before, or less remote work than before? So I'm launching the poll now, and it'll take you only a second or two to complete. So people are completing. We've got 73% of people completed. All right, that's virtually everybody completed. So I'm going to end the polling now. I'm going to share the results. And what we see here is that of the 15 odd people who are here, 11 think that there's going to be more remote work than before. The same as before is what 3 people are saying, and basically no one's saying less remote work than before. Now, we've run this same poll in groups of 200-300 people, and we're getting pretty similar results. So that suggests, if those forecasts are right, that people are expecting the new normal to be a much more digital and a much more distributed kind of a workplace. And that's interesting. And it certainly makes the rest of my presentation relevant, because we're going to be talking about how to make sure that this works well. So from a psychological point of view, one of the questions that one has to ask is this a good thing? Is it good for people to work from home? And the answer is, of course, yes. It's easier to concentrate for many people. Golden and Gajendran undertook a number of studies about remote work in 2019. Actually, wonderful timing for Golden and Gajendran. They probably didn't realize that their research would be so important when they conducted it. But of course, 2020 came along and made the whole remote working thing a very big deal across the world. Allen et al. In 2015, by the way, the references are at the back of this presentation, discovered that you have, across thousands of people, you have slightly higher engagement, which means more positive, more energized employees, less stress and less exhaustion, and that's a good thing. And Gajendra also found that productivity was as good or better than if people were working in the office, and higher organizational citizenship behavior. Let me tell you what we mean by organizational citizenship behavior. Organizational citizenship behavior is behavior where people do good things that they don't absolutely have to do. So volunteering is organizational citizenship behavior. Going the extra distance for a customer is organizational citizenship behavior. Doing something that you don't have to do, but you think it would be a good thing or would help employees or colleagues or the customer if you do that. So you get more of that when people work from home, which is interesting. And as to whether that would be an ongoing phenomenon, whether people feel, okay, well, I'm being given the opportunity to work from home, so therefore I'll do the right thing, or whether it's an enduring thing, that's the interesting next question. But of course, it's also, there are some downsides to working from home. So it's one of those classic results where, yes, there are good things and some bad things. So one of the things that, and this has certainly been mentioned to me in a number of the workshops that I've been running in recent times, blurred boundaries around work and family. I mean, if you are working in an office and you leave the office and go home, it's kind of easy to walk in through your front door and have a clear boundary between those two experiences, the work experience and the home experience. One of the things that we also know is that if you work only with teleworking, that can lead to worse relationships with colleagues. And the simple reason there is that you're not building a personal relationship with those people. You're really dealing with them in a digital form. And in fact, I was running a workshop yesterday and somebody was talking about wearing masks. I mean, the moment you cut down the amount of interpersonal non-verbal communication with people, you are leading to a less broad bandwidth kind of relationship, a more limited kind of a relationship. And also some people are not suited to an environment of less interaction. And that I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because we're going to look at the types of people who are suited to remote work. If you happen to be suited to remote work, it's great. if you happen to be unsuited to remote work, it's really bad for you. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. So what types of people are suited to remote work? Well, I think if you're going to say that somebody's a good remote employee, there are really two factors that you need to consider. One is that a good remote employee has high levels of well-being. In other words, we take a positive psychology perspective there and we say, is this person engaged in their work? Are they resilient? Is their resilience improving? And will this person continue to grow? And when we say grow, we mean acquire skills, become more confident, advance their career, those kinds of things. So in order for an employee to be well suited to remote work, they must be somebody who can do this kind of work and maintain high levels of well-being. The second is high levels of productivity. Counterproductive work behaviors is one component of this, but we know from previous research that on balance, people's levels of productivity are at least as good, if not slightly better, as a group when you're looking at thousands of people, but there are individuals whose productivity will be worse in a remote environment, particularly if they're not well suited to that. And so two things that you have to watch out for from a productivity point of view. One is a thing called counterproductive work behaviors, which is really where employees are doing things which are not good for either their colleagues or for the organization. Now, doing things that are not good for their colleagues, so they could be bullying, exclusion, exclusion being not responding to their colleagues. It could be things like being unkind to colleagues in terms of not including them in things. Those kinds of things are what we call interpersonal counterproductive work behaviors. And then there are organizational counterproductive work behaviors. And we have this wonderful term, which in the United States is called cyber slacking, and in the UK is called cyber loafing. Cyber slacking is where the employee, in fact, doesn't really do work. They're just, planning their next purchase of jeans, or they're just reviewing the internet to see what's going on, or watching YouTube videos or whatever. So the risk of these counterproductive work behaviors in some individuals is higher when they don't have colleagues around them and they don't have a supervisor working with them, largely because certain types of personality types are less likely to do the right thing if they're not being watched. So the well-being factor, there's sort of two components about it. The psychological well-being has traditionally been defined as an absence of mental illness or of mental harm. So it's been the traditional kind of medical model perspective on well-being is that if you're not depressed or you're not anxious, okay, you have high well-being. Personally, I think that's a very depressing definition of well-being. The absence of injury or illness should not be a definition of well-being. But you do have to ask the question, will remote working damage this person? And I'll explain to you the types of personality types that are more likely to be damaged by remote working. But these days, what we're tending to do is to take a positive psychology approach. And what a positive psychology approach means is the person growing? Is the person thriving? Is the person improving? So some ideas out of this: is the person engaged in their work? Are they involved in their work in a positive, energetic fashion? One of the reasons that organizations all over the world talk about engagement is because it's good for employees. Employees, when their levels of engagement are high, say they love their work and they love their organization. But as well as that, it's very good for organizations. When people are highly engaged in their work, they're more productive. They do more work, they do better work. I'll be telling you a little bit about the business case for engagement in a few slides' time. Are they resilient? Is there resilience improvement? And I'm next week running a session for Commerce Ballarat on resilience, and we'll be talking about what causes resilience, where it comes from. But if people have high levels of well-being at work when they're working remotely, they should be resilient. And resilient means I can cope with tough stuff. But as well as that, ideally their resilience should be improving. A good workplace will increase levels of people's resilience. And finally, the point that I raised earlier, will this person continue to grow their skills, grow their experience, and grow their confidence, and grow their career? So if a person has high levels of well-being, that's the first component. The second is counterproductive work behaviors. I mentioned that there are sort of two flavors of counterproductive work behaviors. What you're seeing here is a scale that SACS uses for measurement of counterproductive work behaviors. So I've had no problem being rude to people. I've been impolite to them. I've acted like they don't exist. had difficulty getting along with other people. So these are interpersonal counterproductive work behaviours. Then there are organisational counterproductive work behaviours, taking the property of employers, ignoring safety rules, ignoring rules generally. Those kinds of things are what we call organisational counterproductive work behaviours. So the paradox of working remotely is that some employees do less of these bad things when they're working remotely, and some employees do more. So what is it that drives this? So I think that one of the questions that we have to ask is this staff member suited to remote work? And it may well be that you're sitting there thinking that some of your employees are extremely well suited to remote work and perhaps others not quite so well. So one of the questions we have to ask is about their levels of development. This is a very old model, Hersey and Blanchard, situational leadership, as it's been called. And all I wanted to talk about here is really this component, which is to say that when people are first in their jobs, maybe that's the worst time to send them remote. And in fact, I've had a lot of conversations with clients in recent times about inducting employees who are coming to work remotely. So they come to work remotely, they need to be inducted remotely. In fact, it turns out that their entire work experience from start to training to induction to getting to know people is all happening remotely. And we're starting to see a lot of publications about how to do that, because all over the world, people are inducting employees where they don't walk in through the front door on day one. They actually have to be inducted through Zoom or through Teams meetings or through whatever, but that's a challenge. Now, clearly, if somebody has been with your organization for a while, and so they've got high competence and high commitment, it's sort of easier to send them remote because they know what they're doing, they've got the high competence, but they're also quite confident to work remotely. So there's the question of where they are in their career. And what I'm going to say is that if somebody's early on in their career with you and they're still adjusting to their job, what I'm going to say later in this presentation about how to maintain high levels of engagement with those employees, these are the people you really need to prioritize, because it's likely that they're going to need more support in terms of feeling confident, but also feeling that the organization is supporting them, that they are being what's called socialized into the organization, which means they feel part of the organization. So a couple of characteristics that we know equip people to work remotely. Intelligence, cognitive ability, as it's called, how smart people are. We do know that people with higher cognitive ability adapt more quickly than those people with low cognitive ability. So if you've noticed that some of your employees have adjusted more quickly, they've picked up new ways of working, they've picked up new technology, they've picked up better ways of interacting with their colleagues or clients or whomever, it may well be that they're smart. Those with higher cognitive ability tend to have greater flexibility due to the fact that they learn more quickly. So how smart people are will have a big impact on how likely it is that they'll succeed in a new working environment. And if that new working environment is a remote working environment, then that will have an effect on them. And then we have the thing called personality. Now, everybody that you've ever met has had a personality. I know some people doubt this, but trust me, it's true. Personality is extremely heavily genetically determined. We know from recent longitudinal studies of human development that the big aspects of personality, things like how honest I am, things like how hardworking I am, things like whether I'm an extrovert or an introvert, it seems that that develops pretty much from about 3 years of age. How do we know this? Largely from a study in New Zealand called the Dunedin study, where they studied human development. A guy called Silver, about 45 years ago, decided to identify 1,000 babies and measure their development. And what he discovered is that the observations of toddlers at age 3 correlated extremely heavily with psych tests conducted 40 years later in those people. So we know that personality tends to be largely genetically determined. We know this also by twin studies, and it might be 60 to 70% genetically determined depending on who you talk to from a research point of view. But there are some important pieces of personality that affect whether a person is likely to work remotely, and I'll lead you through a few of those. The first is a thing called integrity modesty, and integrity modesty is the degree to which a person is naturally honest, truthful, trustworthy, and also not arrogant. It's the absence of arrogance. And you'd wonder, what has arrogance to do with honesty? In fact, multiple studies have now shown that arrogant people often have difficulty being honest and straightforward and truthful. And it's theorized that the reason for that is because of the fact that they simply believe that the rules don't apply to them. So if you don't want cyber slacking and slow loafing, and if you don't want your productivity to drop off, if people are going to work remotely, it's a really good idea to recruit people who are high in this characteristic. By the way, people low in this characteristic go to jail more often than people high in this characteristic. So whether people are working remotely or not, it's a good idea to recruit people who are high in this. Second, if people are working remotely, it's a good thing if they are low in this characteristic here, which is called emotionality. Now, people who are high in emotionality often struggle with contact, with the lack of contact that comes from working remotely. In other words, they like to be in a situation where they can interact with people because that gives them support. So let me tell you a couple of signposts that you should look out for. And I certainly will be going into this in a couple of weeks' time in more detail. We have a presentation for Commerce Ballarat, which is about the stress of COVID-19. And I'll be going into the warning signs in a great deal of detail there. But really, there are two types of warning signs for when people are suffering emotionally from working remotely. One is that they under-contact you. In other words, they go missing. They're difficult to contact. Perhaps they don't get back to you so quickly as they used to. That's a warning sign. The other warning sign is when they over-contact you, when they lose confidence so they come to you far more often. This may well be an indicator that this person is high in emotionality. Now, emotionality is really the tendency to see relatively modest things as a big deal. And if a person is highly emotional, then that's one of the reasons why you're going to need to keep closer to them and try to provide them with more support. So look out for those signs of where people are perhaps becoming quieter or becoming more, noisier, I suppose is the opposite of quieter, but where they're contacting you far more than they did previously. Also look out for when people seem to be losing confidence, where maybe you ask them to do something that you think that they are likely to want to do or be able to do, but maybe they come back to you and they just ask for a lot of guidance as to how to do that. That may well mean that they're struggling emotionally with the situation of working remotely. Extroversion. Extroverts in general like to be in company. Now, if you have people who are extreme extroverts and they're working remotely and they're high in emotionality, this is almost the perfect recipe for somebody to be bad at remote work. If somebody is highly emotional, that means that they are likely to feel things very deeply. They're likely to get upset very easily. But if they're also an extreme extrovert, what it means is that when working remotely, they may well not get the sort of comfort of human contact that they would get if they were in an office. So extreme extroverts who are emotionally unstable, you need to keep close to them because once more, two things. One is that they may well be suffering by virtue of the fact that they're remote and that they're not getting the sort of human contact that makes them feel good about themselves. But secondly, if somebody is an extreme extrovert and emotionally unstable, you may well find that they simply go looking for company rather than doing their work. And so that's also a good idea to keep contact with people. This thing here, conscientiousness. Everybody knows about conscientiousness. You've seen it in your workplace. You've seen it in your family. Some people are just naturally organized, hardworking. This, by the way, is really quite heavily genetically determined. Seems to be in the one family, you can get very broad ranges of conscientiousness, but there is a very strong genetic component of this. Identical twins who are separated at birth seem to be very similar in their conscientiousness, even if they've never met each other. Whereas non-identical twins that grow up in the same family don't correlate anywhere near as heavily from a conscientiousness point of view. But if you're going to have people working remotely, it's a really good idea to have people who are highly conscientious. So when people are being sent remote, if they have the characteristic of being naturally hardworking, and you've seen this in the past, you can probably rely on them to retain that characteristic when they're working remotely. The final personality characteristic is about openness to experience. Openness to experience really says, how broad-minded am I? How welcoming am I of a range of new things? If somebody's working remotely and they are broad-minded, they are open-minded, they're much more likely to take up the new challenge more readily because they kind of like new things. They're comfortable with that sort of thing. So just to summarize, people who are very honest tend to do better jobs when they're working remotely. Emotionality, when people are emotionally stable, that's better. Extroverts, if they're extreme extroverts, you just may need to keep close to them to make sure that they're getting the support that they need. By the way, you'll notice that if you start doing things like Friday drinks at 4 o'clock from home, which many organizations are doing now, or they're organizing things like trivia quizzes over Zoom meetings or Microsoft Teams meetings or something like that, people will love that, provided that they are extroverts, because that's just the kind of thing that they're missing out on right now. So if you have extroverted staff, and one of the things that you might consider is the line of work that you're in, if you're in some sort of customer service, it may well be that you've got extroverted employees, because extroverts tend to gravitate towards jobs like that. So running those kinds of activities can be really valuable. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about in just a second is leadership under these remote working times. And I'm going to say leading like a facilitator, where you don't bring the answer, you bring a process. That can be an extremely valuable way of leading people when they're remote. In other words, you put a question to the group, you cause, if you're, for instance, using Microsoft, so if you're using Zoom, you can run breakout rooms to give small groups an opportunity to talk about whatever the solution is. And then you can actually get them to vote for what they want to do. So, you know, how are we going to keep the team together while we're working remotely? Why not hand that over to the employees and simply give them a chance to tell you as a group what they want to do? Then you adopt what they do. That's what we call facilitative leader, where you lead facilitative leadership, where you're leading like a facilitator who brings a process rather than like a boss who brings the answer. That can be a great way of causing people to remain cohesive as a team in these difficult circumstances. Further things, absence of anger. If people are not particularly angry, that's a good thing, and it's related to job performance generally. Conscientiousness, conscientious people are certainly an advantage, and broad-minded people as well. And then values, people who work well in remote circumstances from a values point of view are people who believe. Values are different from personality. Values are all about what we believe is right, what we believe is important. And some people believe that it's good to work autonomously. That's something we know. If you're going to work remotely, you do have to be prepared to work more autonomously. And that's something that can be encouraged by leadership as well. So here is an instrument that we conducted to identify whether people are suited to remote work. And we have a brief poll again. I'm just going to ask you as to a question about whether you believe that all of your employees are suited to remote work. This is a simple one. Yes, no. I'm going to give you an opportunity to complete this. So 76%, 88%. So I'm going to end the polling and share the results. So yeah, about just over half of the people in this meeting feel that some of their employees are not suited to remote work. So that's an interesting question then. We will move on and look at some of the characteristics about keeping employees engaged when working remotely. Now, I've used the term engagement on a couple of occasions now, so let me briefly describe what I mean by that. When people are highly engaged, that means that they are vigorous, that they're dedicated, and they're absorbed in their work. And what we mean by that, vigor is high levels of energy and mental resilience. Dedication is a sense of significance, enthusiasm, and challenge. And absorption is where people are engrossed in their work. They're doing work that they feel is meaningful. They're doing work which they think is significant. Now, this measure of engagement was first discovered or first synthesized by a guy called Bakker in 2011. And this is how organizations around the world see engagement right now. Now, the reason engagement is important is that it's actually an extremely good predictor of outcomes at work. Productivity varies with increases and decreases in engagement. Internal measures like job satisfaction, absenteeism, attraction and retention vary with engagement. External measures such as client satisfaction, stakeholder satisfaction vary with engagement. And in fact, there are a number of studies which show that if you measure the levels of engagement of a customer service person, and then you measure the satisfaction of the customers that they've interacted with, then what you're going to get is about 60% of the customer satisfaction being driven by engagement. OH&S is affected by engagement. So when you have high levels of engagement, the workplace is safer. And profit varies with engagement. We know that where organizations have high levels of engagement, that their profit growth is much more rapid, which is one of the reasons why some of the most commercial organizations in the world are very focused on engagement, and they want to have employees who are highly engaged. So what causes engagement? Well, one of the things that we like to talk about in respect of engagement is that culture is not really corporate at all. We talk about corporate culture all the time, but in fact, if you look at what causes people to have high levels of well-being at work, there are 4 components: my job, my team, my leader, and my organization. My job, my team, and my leader cause 80% of my well-being at work. Now you see this diagram on the left-hand side here, proximal to distal. Proximal means things that are close to me. Distal means things that are far away from me. My job, you can't get much more proximal than that. I'm doing it on a day-to-day basis. The team that I work with, that's proximal, but in fact, in a remote working environment, it's a little bit less proximal because you're not literally seeing your colleagues all the time. You're not literally rubbing shoulders with them. You're not bumping into them in the coffee room or around the water cooler. And my immediate leader. So when we're talking about leadership here, we're not talking about the big boss necessarily. If you're in a small company, yes, it will be the big boss. But if you're in a larger company, the leader that you have in a team of 5, if you're in an organization of 1,000 people, 80% of your well-being comes from that team of 5 rather than from the organization of 1,000. So that says that if we're working effectively remotely, what we have to do is we have to preserve as much as we can of this job, team, leader integrity. And I'll suggest some ways of doing that. Now I want to talk to you about this study. Looks scientific, don't worry about it, it's not that complicated. Ultimately, what we did here is that we measured the levels of engagement of something like 2,700 people across Australia. This was a study that we undertook with Deakin University. And then we measured a bunch of leader behaviors. We're representing only 10 here because these 10 were the ones that mathematically worked best. And what we discovered is that across these 2,700 people, certain of these leader behaviors were very important for maintaining high levels of engagement. The first of them, and the most important, was empowering people. So whether you're working remotely or whether you're working in an office, we have to find ways of empowering people. Now, I used the example before of using facilitative leadership to create a mechanism to find out what's the best, what kind of experiences people want while they're working remotely. The thing that we know is that if you are a top-down leader, if what you're doing is spending your leadership life telling what people what to do, your levels of engagement are likely to be lower. But as well as that, if people then go remote, they will have come to rely on you telling them what to do, so it's a challenge. I would be saying that this is a wonderful opportunity to become a more empowering leader, giving people more of an opportunity to have a say in how they go about things in their leadership tasks. The second characteristic of an effective leader is optimism and positivity. And what we mean by that, I'm not talking about a don't worry, be happy kind of a perspective on life. I'm talking about what in psychology we call self-efficacy. Just very briefly, self-efficacy is the tendency to believe that we will cope. So we will get through this. We will come out of this stronger. We will all support each other. I know that you can cope. I know that I can cope. I know that we can cope. That kind of optimism and positivity is really important. The opposite, by the way, is negativity. And I'm going to talk about how poisonous that is to employees who are working remotely, because the difference is that when you're interacting with people on a day-to-day basis, you're seeing them face to face, for instance, they see your nonverbals, they can see how you are interacting with them. If you say something negative to somebody in a telephone link up and you don't speak to them for 2 days, they are left with that experience for 2 days. I think we have to be really conscious of trying to leave people positive and optimistic in all of our interactions. I've sometimes said there's a worldwide tendency or trend in leadership called authentic leadership. I think that authentic leadership is fine as long as you are authentically positive. If you feel negative, one of the things that we know is that if you act negative, you will bring down the well-being and engagement of your staff. They're likely to be less productive, and they're also likely to have lower levels of well-being. Now is a time for optimism and positivity. Tough times in particular, that's where it can have the greatest effect. Being supportive. Now, one of the things that we find is that as people are working remotely, and it's amazing how many people have told me that their work hours have gone up over the last 6 months or so, because they just don't seem to get away from work. You know, the commuting time that they used to have, well, that's gone. But they seem to be working right from when they would have started commuting till often later in the day. Now, of course, we also understand that there are some people whose organisations are held up, closed down by virtue of the COVID-19 effect. And so for those people, that's a different thing. So supportiveness comes in the form of, if you're pushed, then it's an understanding from the boss asking you if you're coping. If, on the other hand, what you're worried about is the fact I don't have enough work, then again, the boss has to provide a different sort of support, providing evidence that we're doing everything we can, and particularly including staff in activities to try to raise business, to make things better. One of the things that we're seeing from a lot of organisations that are not actually trading at the moment because of the COVID-19 shutdown is just doing things to improve the organisation, doing projects that you never got around to before because you were too busy. This can be really valuable because it creates a psychological impression that, look, we're still going, we're still happening, and we're still moving in the right direction. And the final of these 4 leadership components, helping people to learn. And if you're doing these 3 things here, empowering people, you're optimistic and positive, and you're supportive, that of its very nature helps people to learn. But I think that one of the things that we've seen in the research on remote leadership is that sometimes we can lose track of this "are you growing" type question. So it's really worthwhile for leaders to have conversations with staff about how they're developing, about how they're feeling about their skills, about whether they feel that their skills are heading in the right direction. So there are some things that keep engagement high. Resilience. I don't want to talk a great deal about resilience in this session because I'm running an entire session on resilience next week. But certainly, as you can imagine, we're getting a lot of inquiries from organisations about resilience now, and we're being asked to run a lot of activities to optimise resilience. Just very briefly, it's an ability to cope, a protective factor. And here's the technical definition of resilience as it stands right now: general capacity for flexible and resourceful adaptation to external and internal stressors. Now, I know that's kind of a definition that only a psychologist could possibly love, but what it means is general means you can do it in a range of different circumstances in your life, not just at work, not just at home, but generally. People who are truly resilient are flexible in the way that they adjust and react to things, and they're resourceful. In other words, they're able to turn their hand to a range of different things to make things better. And external stressors are things like COVID-19. Internal stressors are things like fatigue or illness or those kinds of things. Now, in that session next week, I will be talking about a thing called post-traumatic growth. And just a quick mind experiment with you. Think of the thing that caused you to grow most in your career, or life for that matter. It doesn't have to be career. I'll bet it wasn't necessarily an easy thing. So one of the things that we know is that if people are truly resilient, they can grow from tough times rather than to decline. So we'll be talking about that next week in the session on resilience. Now, I talked about leading like a facilitator. This is a simplification. I mean, obviously, this is not 3 points, it's a continuum. But on the left-hand side, you can lead like a boss. And leading like a boss is a top-down style of leadership. So the blue dot is the boss, the white dot is a staff member. And to be a good leader, you need to be able to do top-down leadership. Top-down leadership is crucial. Top-down leadership is where you're going to say to somebody, hey, I need you to do this. You're working your first day, here's what you've got to do. giving instructions to people, it's a crucial skill no matter what level of experience the employee has, whether they're brand new or whether they're very experienced. There are times where you have to say, this is what I need. Model 2 is consultation. Consultation is where I ask this person what they think, I ask this person what they think, I ask this person what they think. Then I go back to my office and I make up my mind. I decide what we're going to do. That's consultation. Model 3 is facilitation. Facilitation is where you would get everybody together. Now, when I say together, it could be in a physical room, but for most cases at the moment, it's virtual rooms. So you can do this on a Zoom meeting, you can do this on a Microsoft Teams meeting. Zoom has the wonderful benefit of being able to run breakout groups very easily, and so you can run small group activities. Facilitative leadership is where the boss brings something that needs to be resolved and brings a process, but does not bring the answers. And so you would bring an issue to your staff, you would get them to discuss the issue amongst themselves, and you would get them to literally vote for the solution. Now, doing this at the moment is an extremely valuable thing to do, because one of the things that we know from the research into remote leadership is that remote leadership tends to make people isolated. If you use this style of leadership, it tends to integrate people and it tends to cause people to interact with each other. Now, if you look at this from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, the highest levels of engagement of staff are where people do this from time to time. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to start doing this. If you've typically been a Model 1 or Model 2 leader only, it's a great opportunity to start doing this. A couple of things. One is that you're going to pump up your levels of engagement straight away. We know that this works. I mean, if we're thinking back to the 4 leadership behaviors, which I said drive engagement, things like empowering, well, clearly it's an empowering style. Things like optimism. If you are causing the staff to come up with the solutions, that of its very nature is optimistic. You have confidence that they can come up with the solutions. The third component is supportive. Well, of course, this style of leadership is supportive. And the fourth component was learning. And when people are asked to solve problems or to improve things at work, then that is what tends to cause people to learn. It's really valuable, better than sending people away on a course. People learn the most valuable things that they learn in their work life in their own workplace. It's called the 80-20 rule of adult learning. 80% of what I learn that's valuable, I learn at work. So, Model 1, Model 2, Model 3, I would be suggesting now is an opportunity to try and get your staff involved in these kinds of activities to increase levels of engagement. As well as that, when you do this with them, they become more confident. And I can't tell you how many bosses I've heard complain over the years, everybody keeps coming to me for answers. Well, maybe that's because you've done a lot of this in the past. You've given them the answers. If you do this, it's something that causes them to come to you with solutions of their own rather than coming to you with problems. And as I say, it's a matter of choosing when to do these 3 things. But particularly if something's to do with well-being, and in fact, I must say that as personally, I tend to use this model of leadership when the issue is really complex, when I think, yeah, I can really do with people's help in this. That's a useful thing to do, that style of facilitative leadership. A couple of things you've got to understand about people working remotely. I mentioned proximal versus distal. One of the challenges of doing everything over a screen is that what were previously close relationships become much more distant relationships. You move from having a social context to isolation, and you have occasional contact versus regular contact. So distance can become the norm, and people can become concerned about the fact that they're losing the corporate culture of their organization. They're losing what the organization really means. This is what I was talking about before. Isolated or occasional contacts can become very significant. So if you think you've said something to somebody and it may well have been a little harsh, then I think it's a really good signal for you to get back on the phone or back on a Zoom meeting or anything like that to tell people, to just check in with them and maybe to correct the impression, explain yourself a little bit more. Otherwise, you run the risk that they might sit there for the next 2 to 3 days thinking that you're in a bad mood with them or something like that. Now, emotional contagion. Human beings are extremely prey to emotional contagion. There are things in your brain called mirror cells, and mirror cells cause you to harmonize with other people. Your feelings, your emotions harmonize with other people. This is how we clan together as human beings. Now, if you're sitting in a group of people and they're all smiling and happy, you get happier. If you're in a group that's angry, well, I mean, I guess in history, we've seen the crowd effect where a crowd becomes angry and it can become hysterical. That's due to the mirror cells. The risk that you run in this kind of thing is that people have an absence of positive emotional contagion. And I think what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that you have an opportunity for people to share emotions in this remote leadership situation. So things that I mentioned before, things that are naturally happy, things like, for instance, Friday afternoon happy hours or something of that nature. It doesn't have to involve alcohol. Give the staff a chance to come up with these things that will give them the positive emotional contagion that they need. But I also want to talk briefly about the ratio between positive versus negative interactions. So I could right now say to you something negative. I won't, because that's extremely bad practice, but I could say something negative or pessimistic to you. I could also say something positive, such as, I'm really enjoying giving this webinar, which is true, by the way. So if I say something negative to you or something positive, a fascinating question in psychology is, do they have the same weight? Is one positive worth the same as one negative? And the answer is no. It turns out that negatives are far more powerful than positives. Now, why is this the case? It's the case because of evolution. In evolution, bad news can kill you. So if somebody says to you, well, look, there's a saber-toothed tiger, I mean, the saber-toothed tiger can eat you. But if somebody says, well, look, this type of food is just around the corner, well, that can be helpful, but it rarely is the difference between life and death. So human beings have come to be very risk averse, very tuned in to bad news. So one negative is worth between 3 and 6 positives for most human beings. And if people are under stress, it's much more likely to be the 6 positives rather than 3 positives. In other words, the more under stress you are, and you might have had this experience, if somebody says something negative to you when you're under stress, it hits you harder than if it was the case when you were in a happy, relaxed frame of mind. So corporate culture, as I said, culture is local, so we'll use the term corporate culture. Corporate culture is purely and simply the balance of good or bad behaviors around you. So in order to have a satisfactory corporate culture, you really need to have 3 or 4 times, ideally 6 times, the number of good behaviors than bad behaviors. Now, this also goes for communication. I think that when you're interacting with people in a remote leadership situation, you have to be upbeat. You have to give them opportunities to look forward to things. You have to talk about what's going well. And if you're interested in this area of resilience, I will be giving some specific techniques in the session next week about how to optimize resilience. Competencies. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but here are some competencies. Key skills and other ability attributes is what that stands for. But people, when they work remotely, they actually have to take more initiative. They also have to analyze for themselves more. In other words, they're less taking instructions from people. They are tending to take initiative and they're tending to analyze their own information. They also have to learn how to cooperate. Telecooperation is a term that's developed here, which is to say, telecooperation is how do we cooperate as a team when everybody else is working through a screen. Virtual self-efficacy. Look, self-efficacy really means a belief that I can do it. Have you noticed that some of your staff are maybe less confident that they can get stuff done by working virtually? That's a decline in self-efficacy. So virtual self-efficacy. Then we have media skills. One of the things that I've noticed over the past 6 months is that 6 months ago, I would run sessions on Zoom meetings, let's say, and you would ask people to go to breakout rooms. They didn't know what to do. You asked them to complete polls. They didn't know what to do. Now everybody's across that. So virtual media skills have improved. But of course, knowing how to use them in your own particular workplace can be important. And virtual social skills, how to build relationships virtually. There's some key competencies. So if you're an organization that's big enough, you might consider running a learning needs analysis. Even small organizations can run a Zoom or Microsoft Teams meeting where you ask your employees, what do you need from us? What do you need to learn? Is there anything that would help you to feel more confident about what you need to do? And then you can develop learning materials, either coach people face-to-face across the Zoom or something like that, or produce materials. By the way, one of the things that we're starting to see is a whole bunch of initiatives about how to induct employees into remote work. So people join an organization, they get sent remote, they should be inducted into the organization, but then they should also be inducted into remote working because there are particular competencies associated with working remotely. Developing relevant performance development materials and evaluating the capacity for working remotely. And one of the things that I do know is that there are a lot of organizations that are asking themselves the question now about how do we evaluate performance when people are distant. You know, the research evidence about defining jobs is all about outcomes. Sadly, job descriptions, well, not particularly sadly, but historically, job descriptions were lists of tasks, right? So you might have 30 or 40 tasks on a job description. I've seen 6-7 pages of tasks. Tasks do not create clarity. Outcomes create clarity. So an outcome is I have to make these customers happy. And in fact, I'll say to you that if a job is properly constructed, you should be able to define that job with a maximum of 7 outcomes. In other words, up to 7 outcomes that will be measured. If you're measuring those outcomes, that's the way to make it simple. Pick out 7 things that are really important. And by the way, going back to facilitative leadership, this is a really useful technique. Work with the employees, you know, in a Zoom meeting, in a Teams meeting. Let's talk about the outcomes that relate to success in our job. If you can then measure those outcomes, you've got the perfect performance development process. Measure a small number of really important outcomes. That's what can be really important. Build competencies by coaching, training, and development. That's pretty obvious stuff. So maximizing engagement in remote staff. Well, this is just a diagram that shows what we mean. You can see that this work group of 124 people has relatively low levels of engagement. And you see the 3 components of engagement. Energy is the big problem here. Mind you, flow and commitment are not fantastic, but energy is really low. So if you find out that your work group has low levels of energy, then what you really need to do is to focus on some of the things that we're talking about here. Recruiting for it, we mentioned that earlier, but then leading for it. Tip number 1, plan your interactions with staff. How often and what? And so one of the things that really people want when they're working remotely is structure. Sometimes when people have gone remote, they've said to me, well, it's almost like we had this planned workplace and now it's completely laissez-faire. We don't know how our week is structured. Why not get the employees together in a facilitative leadership sense and work through with them? Let's build a structure. What do you guys want? Do we start off with a Monday meeting? Do we have a catch up on Wednesdays? Do we have drinks on Friday? Whatever. Plan that out. And if you can get the staff involved in planning that, that will be really valuable. Empowerment, I mentioned that. Resilience and productivity come from that. Maximize the positive in your interactions with them. Feed forward. I don't know if you've ever heard this term. Feed forward is a style of interaction when you need somebody to do something different. Historically, what people have done is they've used a technique called feedback, where you comment on the past. For neurological reasons, feedback tends to engender defensiveness. I don't have time to explain exactly why from a neurological point of view. Let's put it this way. Whatever you focus on turns on certain parts of your brain. When you focus on the past, here is what you did. What you tend to do is to turn on a part of the brain that's geared with anger, fear, depression, fight, flight response. So the alternative is feed forward. Instead of telling people what they've done wrong in the past or telling them where you feel that they should improve, give them guidance about what you want them to do in the future. So instead of saying, here is what's wrong with this work, what you do is you say, here's what I need you to do in future. Now, both can be very assertive communications, but there is good, strong research evidence that when you use feed forward guidance about the future, people learn more quickly than with feedback. So I think that telling somebody that they've done something wrong, or here's what's wrong with your report that you did, or here's what's wrong with that interaction that you had with the customer, telling them, look, next time what we need to do is this, that can be a way of making those interactions less defensive. And use facilitative leadership to cause your people to team up. Instead of saying, Mary, can you do this? Bill, can you do this? Jane, can you do this? Maybe what you do is you say, Bill, Mary, and Jane, can you solve this problem? Can you come up with a solution for this? Can you work together to achieve this outcome? I think you have to be more conscious in remote work to cause people to act in a teamworky kind of a way. And this is really just about stress. I mean, what we know is that when people have low levels of control, they tend to be more stressed. So if people have demands and they're stressed either by the situation or by workload, this is just really another case where it's a really good idea to make sure that people are supported and that they are empowered. Just want to finish off with another slice of proximal versus distal. Did you know that certain types of communication are more proximal than others? So starting with distal, snail mail. So I want to give you a message. So I write you a letter, I type it out, and I get it on a real piece of paper and I put it in an envelope and I send it to you. That's about as distal as you can possibly get. It's distal in time. Actually, at the moment in Victoria, it might well take 3 weeks to get there. So it's really distal. But it's also distal because it's been through a process and you get this physical piece of paper. A text, a static text, is also quite distal, and an email is almost exactly as distal. A live chat, conversational, say you're using something like Microsoft Teams, its chat option, that's less distal. A teleconference, you're talking to people on the phone with multiple people, that's less distal. Then a one-on-one phone conversation is less distal. Video conference, large group webinar, that's kind of distal. That's actually, well, in a situation like this, where you don't get to see, I don't get to see the non-verbals of people, that's really distal. Video conference in a small group or to one person, that's getting quite proximal. And then you have the physical thing of we're in the same room. My guidance to you in this, or my advice, is take the opportunity to try to be as proximal as often as you can in communication. So if you would typically just email something to somebody about something, why not ring them up? Because that's more proximal. Or maybe you just start an instant Zoom meeting or an instant Teams meeting and invite them. And maybe you ring them to set this up. But I think the thing to be conscious of is that it's not about the message alone. It's about the bonding that comes through that situation. So it's a really good opportunity to work, to choose the things that are at the top of this scale. That's what will tend to make people, or tend to work for people's effectiveness. So just moving on. So leadership, I mentioned this, optimism, encouraging staff to make decisions, leading like a facilitator and coach. So the summary and conclusion. So the remote workforce does have risk from an engagement point of view. You run the risk that, say, a couple of things. One is that people who love being in a work group, they just love their work less. So we have to work harder to try and bring them to a situation where they're going to be comfortable. Secondly, I think you need to plan your leadership in ways that have not been so crucial when you have water cooler conversations. The informal interactions that people have can be incredibly valuable, and you just don't have them anymore, do you? It's not like you're going to bump into people as they're starting work or leaving work, or maybe they're having a glass of water or they're sitting down having lunch in the lunchroom. You've lost some of that. So we need to plan to interact with people more. Proximal works, distal doesn't. Use that to guide your interactions. In other words, make sure that you're trying to get your communications as proximal as possible. Use facilitative leadership when you can. So rather than being a boss, be a communicator who is going to cause staff to make their decisions as much as possible. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. I'm going to check the chat to see if there's anything that we need to focus on. How much latitude do you give staff who are obviously struggling with motivation and at times depression during COVID? So that's a question. One of the things that I would say about that, check in, and by the way, it's a good idea to come to the next couple of sessions because I'll be getting into that very specifically. But I think that one of the most powerful things that you can do is to keep in touch with people, and asking people, are they okay, is a really valuable thing to do. But join us for the next couple of sessions and I'll suggest some ways on top of are you okay? The challenge, of course, to a lot of people is are you okay is a very difficult question to answer, particularly if they're concerned that they will affect their image in your eyes by answering truthfully and they're struggling. So I'll suggest some alternatives for getting that result. I hope the rest of your day is highly engaged and that your exercises in remote leadership work well. Thanks very much for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.